Alright, everybody, for today's critical thought, we're going to be discussing the 5-letter word that no gamer likes to hear, and that is grind. When does a game become a grind to play, and what are some steps to mitigate it? Now, we've talked about grinding in video games in the past, and it's one of those topics that can be kind of hard to nail down as to when a game crosses that line, because you're still just playing the game as you were the last few minutes, hours, or days. But when the game does start to grind on you, you can definitely feel it. And at best, it can be the sour patch in a great game, and at worst, it can completely dissuade someone from continuing to play your title. And grinding can exist in almost any kind of game, but typically we see this with abstraction or abstracted based titles. And part of grinding has to do with just what is your goal of the game. And for my definition, grinding occurs when the only way for the player to actually move forward is reduced to only a set or a fixed number of options, and anything else that the player does will not progress the game in any way, shape, or form. It's kind of like the idea that you can play this game 10 different ways, but only one way will actually get you to see the end. And as I said a few seconds ago, grinding typically occurs in abstracted based titles, especially RPGs, because as we've talked about before, with an abstraction or an abstracted point of view, the player can't do anything on their end to impact how things go. Again, I can't mash my left mouse button to make my guy swing harder, or I can't be jumping left and right and my character will react that same way. And one of the most famous examples of grinding, of course, comes from the MMO genre. And MMOs have been trying to fight grind for years. And it usually has to do with balancing progression with what content there is in the game. For instance, when I played World of Warcraft way back in the dark ages of 2004, I ran into a situation with my Warlock where I was level 45, the next quest chain begins at level 50, and there was no other quest to do for 5 levels. So what that meant was anything else that I would do other than just killing nameless mobs for hours upon hours wasn't giving me progress. The other quests I didn't do, I'm too high level, so they don't count. I can't go do crafting because crafting is its own experience. Can't do any more raids because, again, they're too low level for me. And so I spent a few days, I think maybe a week, just grinding out those 5 levels, and by the time I was done, I was so sick and tired of World of Warcraft that began my slow, or actually reasonably fast, descent into just quitting that game completely. Now, when it comes to an MMO, usually the best ways to combat grind have to do with things from a content point of view. As long as the player has something to do, some other task they can go after that will earn them rewards, then the game doesn't feel like a grind. And one of the best examples that I've played of a game that did that was Guild Wars 2. What Guild Wars 2 did that was quite frankly like a brilliant example of fighting against grind was basically allowing the player to literally go anywhere within the game space and have the content or have them be either lowered or raised, or I'm sorry, it's usually just lowered down to that level and scaling them down while still keeping whatever powers they had. The only difference came to how much damage they would actually do. So a skill that I unlocked at level 40, I could still use that if I was scaled down to level 10, but it would be doing comparatively level 10 damage. And the beauty of this was that even though I was scaled down, anything that I accomplished in each zone or area would give me scaled up experience to whatever my actual level was. So this may or may not make sense, but I could be a level 45 character, go to a level 20 zone, play it as a level 20 character and complete quests as it, but get experience and loot as my original level. And again, the beauty of this kind of system was no matter what I was doing, no matter how long I played, no matter what zone I was in, I was always moving forward in terms of progress. And as long as you're feeling, or as long as something is happening that's improving the player, the game doesn't become a grind. Now, with that said though, Guild Wars is obviously an MMO, it's a multiplayer game. But what happens when we talk about single player titles? That's when things get a lot more interesting. Because single player wise, you don't have another player to bounce off of. Typically, you're either playing against an AI or you're kind of playing against the game. As in, the game spawns enemies, creates maps, stuff like that. So, in that case, when does a game become a grind and how do you deal with it at that point? And two examples I've played lately, which if you're fans of mine, you probably know what's coming. The first one is The Darkest Dungeon. While I love The Darkest Dungeon, it's one of my favorite games, it has a lot of grinding in the mid and end game portions of that title. And Red Hook has been doing what they can to mitigate it. But if somehow you're watching this video and you know who I am but don't know about Darkest Dungeon, how it works is that the persistence system in Darkest Dungeon involves finding heirlooms on each of the game's procedurally generated quests. You use those heirlooms to upgrade the various utilities or services in your town, which in turn provide additional benefits. You upgrade the blacksmith, you can make your weapons stronger. You upgrade the pub, you can recover your characters faster. And the cost gets progressively more expensive as you upgrade and whatever difficulty you're playing on. But the thing is, these upgrades require fixed heirlooms. So if I have deeds and the building I want to upgrade only takes paintings, well, I can't do anything with it. And then the endgame portion of the Darkest Dungeon grind is that the only way to beat the final set of levels, which are technically we could say 4 fixed levels or missions, is that you must get a group of 4 level 6 characters. They must have, all their weapons and armor spec'd up. Usually their skills are leveled up. And in some cases you may cultivate positive quirks on them. But here's where things get very annoying. When you complete a Darkest Dungeon mission, whatever or whoever 4 characters you take on that mission cannot go on another Darkest Dungeon level. The in-game lore rationale is that they're basically scarred for life. But here's the point. When you lose those 4 characters, just as if a character dies, you lose all the time spent leveling them up, all the money you use to power them up, and then, of course, all the additional resources that were needed to get them to that point. And that is a lot of elements or a lot of resources that are lost. Now, of course, you can take those characters and basically use them in lower level missions to race up other ones, but it's not the same as basically throwing out all that time. Now, getting back to the point of grinding, this is a perfect example of this. Because it doesn't matter what missions I run if I'm not getting the heirlooms I need, or I'm not leveling up the people that I'm going to eventually take into the Darkest Dungeon. That's all wasted time on my part, and it becomes more of a grind the further you get into the game. Once you run out of places to level up, once you run out of the various utilities to level up, then the only point of endgame progression are your characters. So during my first play of the Darkest Dungeon, this was, I think, retail version wise, I was at that point where everything was fully upgraded, but I still had to spend good 2 to 3 hours of play to then make a 40-minute attempt on a Darkest Dungeon level. If I fail, then I gotta do it again, and again. And it just got to a point where I just said, I'm done. I didn't want to play the game anymore. Now, Red Hook has been trying to fix this over the many DLCs and patches, and it works, but at the same time, it still hits that point of a grind. They've added in the ability to trade in heirlooms, so that if I go on a mission, I get a bunch of deeds and I can't use them, I can trade them in for the other ones. And there's now a secondary progression in the form of districts that are a massive resource sink, but provide a permanent benefit. And while these are certainly great ways to go forward, it still doesn't replace the end game grind. They allow you to get an upgrade that lets the game spawn higher level characters at the get go, but they can come with worse quirks. So it's kind of a pro and con there. But again, so much of the Darkest Dungeon's mid and late game revolves the player going on these quests, possibly ending up with less characters or making them worse, and there's still not a guarantee that they're going to be able to move forward or make any form of progression. And as we've talked about before, when it comes to video games, be it of any genre or design, you never want progression to be randomized. As in, maybe I'll get something that helps, maybe I'll get nothing. Because if the player is not moving forward, then the game becomes a grind and it feels like they're just spinning their wheels. And speaking of which, we have a new example that I can bring up here, and that is Cultist Simulator. I've put up a few guides and my review is up, and while I enjoy that game, it is a pitch-perfect example of grinding. Now, to explain the intricacies of the game is going to be a little too much for this video, but here's the Cliff's Notes version. To win and make progress in Cultist Simulator, you need to find various lore, and the lore itself is categorized by different aspects. Think of it as different kinds of Lovecraftian themes. So there's the aspect of Grail, Lantern, Edge, so on and so forth. Each piece of lore that that has a respective level to that aspect. So it could be a level 10 lore, a level 15, and so on. To make progress, the game basically gates you at specific levels of lore. For instance, at one point you cannot move forward until you have at least a level 6 lore. And then the next thing is a level 10. And then one of the final challenges is a level 31. Now, this sounds okay so far, but here's where things get annoying. Because the lore is broken down to different aspects, only 2, maybe 3 of these aspects are you going to actually need. And then there's, I think, 5 or 6. I can't look it up right now as I'm talking. But to get those aspects, you need to go on expeditions. And these are little quest vignettes that can take a good 4 to 5 minutes, plus the time it takes to prepare for them. The downside is that the rewards that you get for the expeditions are 100% randomized. Now, the harder the expedition, the higher the quality of the reward. But again, if I need, let's say, the edge aspect to move forward, and I'm not getting it, then everything I'm doing is a waste. There's no other way to basically move forward in the story without getting the right aspects that I need. You can also level up aspects, but they have to be of similar type and similar level. So, a lot of the time spent in Cultist Simulator is dead time, as I'm trying to hopefully get what I need so that I can actually make an attempt at another expedition, so I can maybe get the lore that I need to then upgrade what I already have, to then hopefully get to the point where I can make progress. And all the while, all the negative events are possibly happening. I'm dealing with the people trying to come and get me, and trying to make sure that my resources keep going up. But again, as the definition of a grind goes, I only have 1 or 2 ways to actually make progress, and everything else simply doesn't matter. And that's not good. And again, when you're trying to compact grind like this, you need to look at what exactly the player needs to go forward and figure out as many ways as you can for the player to accomplish that task. Maybe I can craft or buy lore. Maybe there's a way to send a member of my cult out to find stuff. Maybe I can get a random event that could maybe spur me along. Again, anything that you can do so that it's not just 1 or 2 ways of progressing will help grind. And of the examples that we've talked about today, Guild Wars 2 is, again, I think, the best example of how to counter that level of grind. Because as long as the player is making progress, whether it is by miles, feet, or even inches, they're going to still want to keep playing. The minute that it just becomes a case that I'm just repeating the same thing over and over again and not much is happening, that's when you lose the player. And once you start losing players to grind, you're not going to get them back unless you take drastic steps to implement new systems or mechanics to counteract it. But with that said, we're going to wrap things up for today's critical thought. For you watching this right now, can you think of examples of games that were ruined by grind? And can you think of games that had grind but managed to counter them with a unique system or mechanic? Let me know in the comments below, but thanks again for watching. Be sure to check back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and craft of game design. Until next time, have a great night. Before we get to the credits, just want to give a quick shout out to the fans and supporters over on patreon.com/GWBycer. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Check back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. If you'd like to suggest games for me to cover or topics to talk about, let me know in the comments below. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on design, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the Game Wisdom Patreon, you can find us on there on patreon.com/GWBycer. $1 will get you into our private Discord channel where we talk game topics and more. $5 will get you voting privileges for any major event, including the Saturday Night Grab Bag, Patreon-funded goals, and more. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you enjoy more videos here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel.